When you're drawing with watercolour pencils or coloured pencils, it's always a good idea to think quite broadly first of all with a drawing, and it's really useful to think about drawing not on white paper but on coloured paper. This is particularly useful when you're drawing with things like pastel. So you want a paper that's a kind of mid-tone. You can experiment with different colours of paper. In this instance I'm using a recycled sketchbook. But when you're working with that mid-tone paper, you can almost think about the idea that the figure is already on the paper, and that what you're doing with your drawing is that you're trying to pick out those elements of the figure that are darker than that tone and lighter than that tone. Someone's obviously sort of trying to think about those shapes of the figure and also those negative shapes around the figure, particularly paying attention to things like the relationship that the head has with the body. It's very easy to get lost in the proportions of the head without seeing how big that head is in relationship to everything else. So you're constantly trying to make kind of relationships between everything. So this space inside here, how far is that knee in relationship to the chest? How far is this foot in relationship to what you've already drawn? So comparative measurement is really advantageous. Once you've got the basic structure of the body, you can start to look a little bit more at some of the nuances of what you're drawing. And that's where you can start to go a bit heavier. But it's quite nice to experiment with layered colour. So that's where keeping the weave of the drawing open is really useful. So not going in too heavy too soon with your colour. So I sometimes just like to kind of skim around my pencil case, grabbing a colour and then asking myself the question, where could that colour go? I often think it's a good idea when you're making a drawing to think about the ground that you're working against. So if you're working on a mid-tone ground, I'd often start with a medium that's quite similar to that ground in colour, which means that I can establish drawing, but if I've not quite seen the drawing, it's relatively easy to work back into that drawing with a lighter or darker colour, and my original mistakes will disappear. If I'm working on a white ground, then I might start off too light. Working on a black ground or a dark ground, then starting off too dark. Gradually working up to the lights. Obviously if you work too much on the surface. You get to a point where you fill up the grain of the paper and it becomes quite difficult to work back into the drawing. Of course, these pencils are water soluble, which means that you can combine them with wash media as well. So even just using a brush will enable you to move the colour around. In this instance as well, one needs to be conscious of the fact that the tones may be giving you a false reading initially, just because the paper itself may be darkening because it's getting wet. So in this instance, I'm now going to start to work into the drawing with white gouache. This enables me to define some of the negative space behind the figure.